This is a Blender Python tutorial where we'll be continuing to work with geometry nodes using a Python script. We'll be adding more detail to the scene and animating one of the Geo Node fields. Hey, I'm Victor Stepanov, and I'll be guiding you through this Blender Python tutorial. This is a second part of a mini-series where we're working on a scene that has a subdivided and triangulated cube created by a geometry nodes network that in turn is generated by a Python script. In this video, we'll be splitting up the faces into separate groups using the Separate Geometry node, animating a select group of those faces, and then joining everything back together with a Join Geometry node. Let's get started. If you're just joining us, I have the code from the previous video in the description under Initial Code. Open that link in your favorite browser, hit Raw, select the code and copy it. Open Blender and navigate to the Geometry Nodes workspace. Replace the spreadsheet right here with the 3D viewport and then the 3D viewport with the text editor. You don't really have to have the text editor here. I'm just doing this because I have a camera right here to make it easier to explain things for you. So hit New and then paste in that code that you just copied. Go ahead and execute that code. And I'm going to hit Control Space to take a closer look, and you should get this scene right here. And this is all generated with a Python script. And if you go and take a look at the Geometry Nodes network, you should see something like this, where you have the cube, the subdivided mesh, and then the triangulate, geometry node, split edges, and then scale elements. And this is what we will be starting with today. The very first thing that I want to do is I want to make the geometry nodes right here active when we finish the script. So each time when I run the script, I'll run the script again. You can see that we won't get the geometry nodes network that we created until we select the geometry nodes modifier right here. And I don't want to do this each time when I rerun the script, and I'll just make that geometry nodes modifier active at the very end, because this happens because we're adding the solidify modifier at the very end, and it's the last modifier, and it will be active when our script is done running. And here's the code. I've added a comment, and we're taking the currently active object, which is our cube, and looking into the modifiers, in particular the geometry nodes, and making it active, setting that is active property to true. Now let's go ahead and execute this script and watch. I'm going to select the solidify modifier right here and watch as I run it. Now the modifier that will be active is the geometry nodes. So that is what I want to do first. Let's start off by adding a separate geometry node right between the split edges and the scale elements. Let's go up here and find that piece of code where we need to add this code into. So this is the split edges and this is the scale elements, and I'm going to add that node right here. And here's the code. Again, I'm looking up the name of the type of this geometry nodes in Blender's documentation, and I'm doing exactly the same thing that we did with the other nodes before. I'm going to go ahead and run our script, and you can see that we now have this separate geometry node in between these two nodes, but it's not connected, and let's fix that. And I'll go right here and define that link. And the very first thing that I need to do is I need to connect the split edges node. This is a reference to that, and the separate geometry node, so the from and the to node, and I'm connecting the mesh, so the split edges mesh right here, so this socket right here, into the separate geometry and then geometry socket, the input socket right here. Let's go ahead and execute that, and you can see that now the split edges is connected to the separate geometry. Now we need to update the other link. So right now the split edges is also connecting into the scale elements, and we don't want that. I want to connect the selection right here, the selection socket, and the geometry socket right here. And I'm just going to take that separate geometry and then paste that right here. And then I'll need to update the output socket, which is not mesh anymore. It's a selection like so. And this should work. Now let's go ahead and run our script. And now you can see that this separate geometry node is connected to the rest of the network. Now I'm going to press Control Space, and you can see there's actually no selection going on. It has selected all the faces of our mesh, and we don't want to do that. To fix that, we'll need to define a node that will use this selection input to allow us to select only some into our selection group. And the simplest way to do this is using the random value node, and let's add that next. And actually, before I forget, let me update this to faces because I want to separate faces into separate groups. After I've updated the geometry node field right here, I'm going to go into the scripting workspace, and then at the bottom right here in the info panel, I'm going to copy the last command, which is updating the domain, and I'm going to find the separate geometry node command, paste that command in, and since we are getting the reference to the node, I can just copy that and replace everything up to here, and that will be exactly the same code, but way shorter than it was. Let's go ahead. I'm going to update this point again and rerun our script, and you can see now our script is setting that input as well. Now let's add the random value node. I'm going to do it right before we create our separate geometry geo node right here. And here is the code right here. Again, I'm looking up the type name for the random value node in Blender's documentation. I'm getting the reference to that node, and I'm updating the data type the same way as I got the domain. So this is how I'm setting that, and I want to make sure to use the Boolean, so true or false random value. Now, one of the things that I'm not doing here is, if you look at the very end, I'm not using the step, so we're going to be putting the node right on top of our separate geometry node. Let's go ahead and execute our script, and if I move our separate geometry, you can see that we've added the random value right here, and the type is Boolean. And now we need to connect this value to this selection, and let's do that next. So like this. Let's actually take a look how it would look if we are successful. So you can see now only part of the faces are actually available for us right here, and that's because we're randomly selecting them using this node. Let me go ahead and connect these two nodes, so the separate geometry and the random value, right after we add the separate geometry node. And here is the code. I'm using the from node as the random value node, and then I'm connecting it to the separate geometry node. I'm using the value output socket and the selection output socket. Let's go ahead and run this, and this actually won't work, but I'll explain after we run it. And you can see that for some reason we did execute this piece of code right here, but we're not really connecting the value to the selection. And the reason for that is, we look at the random value node, we have different data types right here. One of the issues here is, for each one of these data types, this socket, this value socket, is going to have the same name. This is very unfortunate. Let's find the data that we've actually connected, and I think it's the vector. And yes, so you can see that the vector is connected. As soon as I select it, it does connect the value and the selection, but this is not what we really want. We want the Boolean, and to do that we need to create a lookup table for each one of these socket values. If you're not sure what that means, I'll explain in just a minute. Let's go here, and let me output all the output sockets of this random value node. And here is that temporary code. I'm creating a dictionary called sockets, and then I'm going over all the output values and assigning each socket once to the socket variable, and I'm creating a new entry in the sockets dictionary with the socket type and the socket itself. Then I'm importing a pretty print right here and then using pretty print to print this dictionary. Now, all of this is temporary code. I'm going to delete it once I'm done explaining this. So don't worry about having this import right here. I'm going to go ahead and run the script. And again, everything is running right. And to see the output of this pretty print, we would need to go in under Window and toggle System Console. This is only available on Windows, unfortunately. For Mac and Linux, you'll need to follow my other tutorials to help you set this System Console up. I'm going to click that and I'm going to zoom in. And this is what this dictionary has inside of it. So it's the type, so Boolean int value vector, and then the socket output itself. You can see that actually this random value node has more than one output. On the UI, it looks like there's only one, but actually under the hood, there's 4 of them. And in particular, the one that we need is the Boolean, which is output 3. Let's go ahead and try to use, instead of value, the index of the output. So I'm going to replace value with 3, and let's rerun our script. And look at that. Now our random value node value is connected to the selection. I'm going to hover over the 3D viewport, press space, and you can see that now we have started to select the groups of these spaces. At this point, I can leave the code like this, but to be honest, this is not really readable. Like, there's some output, and like after maybe a month or two, when I come back to this code, it's going to have outputs 3, which I won't have any idea what that means. And I want to implement some code that will allow me to make this more readable. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to create a lookup table using the same method that we just did right here. I'm going to use this dictionary, and here is the code right here. Actually, it's the very same code as I'm doing right here. So these 3 lines fit into a single line. Notice that this for loop is exactly the same right here. And then the body of this for loop is actually in front. So I'm creating a key and then a value. So this is a key value pair. And then these brackets tell Python that this is a dictionary. So you can leave this code as is, like here, or use this 1-line version. It's all up to you. So you would maybe just use that like so, and it'll be the same exact thing. Now, this is called dictionary comprehension. It's pretty advanced thing if you're just starting out. I would probably recommend not using this and just going with this, but I just want to make sure that you know that there's a 1-line solution to our problem. I'm going to go ahead and use this 1-line solution. I'm going to remove this code right here, and I'm going to use this lookup right here. Now, I'm not going to be using this 3. I'm going to be actually using this Boolean type. And remember, from the output, we have the types, and the type that we need is actually this. And I'm going to create a separate variable right here to define that like that. So it's the target output type. I'm going to use this right here. So I'm using this value here, and then I'm using this value right here as well. Now, we don't need this from node anymore because we're using the reference to the output socket directly like this. And this should allow us to do exactly the same thing. And you can see that these 2 nodes are still connected. And I want to let you know that this is pretty advanced stuff. So if this is not making sense for you, don't worry. It's not you, it's just the content. Right? I have a number of videos for beginners if you're just beginning with Python, so don't let this scare you off. Now, the next thing that I need to do is I want to update the y coordinate of the random value node. And to do that, I need to define a new parameter. So in the create node function, I want to add a new line that's going to allow us to update the y location. So we we've been using the X location, and now I want to also update the Y, and I'll provide that as a parameter right here. And by default, I want to set this to 0, so nothing's going to change in all the other instances where we're calling the create node. But in the creation node for our random value node, I want to use that and set that to -200, like so. And now when I run the script, this will allow us to see that the node is going to be a bit below this separate geometry. Let's go ahead and rerun the script. And now you can see that now this is a lot more readable from the node's perspective. Now we have a lot of things going on right here. So we're creating this random value node, we're creating this separate geometry node, and we're scaling these elements. I'm going to go ahead and select all this code and start moving it and cleaning it up to make it a bit more organized. I'm going to go ahead and press Control X at that code, and I'm going to go up here and define a new function called Separate Faces and Animate. And here is the code. I've named it Separate Faces and Animate Scale. I'm passing in the node tree, the location on the X, and the step on the X. I've pasted in all that code we cut out from below, which has the creation of the random value node, separate geometry node, and the scale elements. Now, all of this can be called from that place where we cut that out. So it's right here. And to make this work, we need to return 3 things from this function, and that is the separate geometry node, scale elements node, and the X location. And let's go ahead and go down and add it right here. And here it is. And okay, that's very long. Okay, and let's go ahead and try to run the script and make sure that it still works. And yeah, everything still works. Let's continue to clean up our code. We can continue to split up this function into more functions, and in particular, we can separate the code that creates our separate geometry node into another function and call it create separate geometry node. Here it is, create separate geometry node, passing in the node tree, the location, and the step, and returning the separate geometry node and the location on the X. Let's go ahead and add that call down here, and then return this like so. And let's go ahead and rerun our script, and everything is still working. And we can create one more function out of this, and that is the create random node value function. I'm going to cut that code. I'm going to go up here and define that function. And here's that function, create random bool value node, passing in again the node tree, the X, and the Y location. And actually here I can return the socket itself. So instead of using that, I can get this right here and then call it target, return the target output socket, and we can go ahead and call this function instead of that code right here, set this the Y location to -200 and return the random value output node socket and use that right here. So instead of doing this lookup, I'm doing this lookup in that function above, and I'm already getting the reference to that socket that we need here, and I'm passing it in as that link. Let's go ahead and run the script to make sure that everything's working, and it is. That's great. And I extracted this as well here because I want to reuse it in another function, in particular for the scale elements. I want to scale only some of the faces, and I'll be reusing this function in just a minute. Let's go ahead and use that function for the scale elements, and I'm going to go right here and define that and call that random value creation node and call that function here. I'm also going to just copy that link that's created between the separate geometry node and the random value node. I'm going to go down here, and instead of using that separate geometry node, I'm going to use the scale elements node. So I'm going to replace that 2 node here. Now let's take a closer look at our mesh. You can see that all the faces that we've selected are getting scaled, but as soon as I run this code, now that I'm selecting randomly, so I'm using this right here, this will allow me to scale only some of the faces. Go ahead and run the script and look at that. You can see that not all the faces have been scaled. Like for example, right here, you can see that these faces have definitely not been scaled. You can see the places where there are actual squares, so you can tell by that. All right, and one thing that we can do is we can go into the update GeoNode tree, and at the bottom where we're connecting the separate geometry node and the scale elements node, I'm going to cut this right here, and I'm going to move that into this function. Since we're creating the separate geometry node and the scale elements node here, it might as well can do the connection here as well. Let's go ahead and rerun the script, and you can see it continues to work as expected. Okay, and now we can extract even more code, and I'm going to be extracting the code that creates the scale elements and using a separate function for that. I'm going to go up here and define a new function, and that's the function. That's create scale geo node, passing in the node tree, the geo node selection node, the x location, and the step. And this right here, and I'm passing in this geo selection node output to replace this with this right here. So instead of us hard coding the selection, so you can see that the separate geometry node has the selection and inverted, and to allow us to select between these two sockets, I want to make it more general, and I want to use a variable to represent that. Now let me cut that right there. I'm going to paste that in right here. I'm going to go ahead and copy all this and call it right here. And I'm going to return the scale elements node and the x location. And that is there. And I'm going to copy that. And instead of using this geo node selection, since that's just an argument name, I'm going to go ahead and get the separate geometry node output. So the from node, again, I'm replacing that with the separate geometry node, and it should look like this. I'm looking into the outputs and using that selection. Let's go ahead and run the script to make sure that everything is still working. And it's not because I forgot to delete this line. So now we don't need it because we're passing in the socket itself. And let's remove that, run it, and now, okay, now we can see that this continues to work. And this right here is defining this link that you see right here. And I want to replace the selection with the inverted just to show you how we can use this. So I'm going to go into the call side of this function and replace this selection with the inverted label. So this right here. Let me run the script, and you can see now we can easily select between those two sockets. Right, I'm going to revert that back. Okay, now let me copy this line, and now we can use these two. We can have two scale elements nodes, one for the selection and one for the inverted socket right here, like this. And let me go ahead and execute script. And you can see we have two of these nodes right here, but I actually want them to be on top of each other in a single column. And to do that, instead of passing in the step on the X, I'm going to use just a value on the Y like this. I'm going to be replacing that argument which defines the step with just the value of the Y location. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. So I'm going to set this to 200 and I'm going to set this to minus 200. I'm going to go above where this is defined, and instead of this, I'm going to use this Y location, and I'm going to pass it along right here like this. And as you remember at the very beginning, we defined, we added the Y location for the create node, and I'm going to be using that right here. So instead of that step, I'm just using the Y location, setting that to this. And since I'm not going to be moving anything on the X location, I'm just going to remove this, and I'm going to remove these two. So I'm just returning the nodes. I'm going to rename this to top Scale Elements Node, and this to bottom. And I'm going to return just the top one for now. And let's see. It looks like everything should work. Let's go ahead and run our script. And you can see that this is almost working. We need to update the X location for the output right here. But actually, I can see that the selection, the random value, the two of these nodes are in the same place. Let's figure out what's going wrong there. And I found out what the issue was. I forgot to update the create random bool value. Need to use this right here. So right here, it's hard coded to minus 200. And I want to use the value that we're passing in down below. So right here where we're creating this random value bool node, I want them to use this right here. Let's go back. Let's go ahead and run our script. And okay, now this looks a lot better. Now you can see that our nodes are in the way that we want them to, except the output node. Let me fix that. And to fix that, I need to add a new line right here and just add the X location and the step. Let's run that script. And you can see now we have this correctly going like so. Now that we have these two nodes right here, I also want to connect this node right here to the final output. And to do that, we'll need to use the join geometry node in between these nodes. And I'll go ahead and define that right here. And here is that line. I'm creating a new node that has a type of geometry node join geometry. Again, I'm looking this up in the Blender's documentation. A very similar setup as we've created any other node. We're getting the reference to that node and the updated X location. Let's go ahead and run the script. And you can see now we have this node, and now we need to connect the sockets, so the geometry sockets of the two scale element nodes. And to do that, we want to create a list of those two geometry nodes and then loop over that list and create the links. So I'm defining a new list up here, and I want to append this node, and I want to append the bottom node as well. Now we have a list, and that has two of the nodes that we've created, so the top and the bottom scale node. Now let's go ahead and loop over those two nodes and connect them to the join geometry node. And here is that code. We're going over that list of those scale element nodes. We're assigning that each of those scale element nodes to this node. That will be the from node. We're using the join geometry node as the to node. We're connecting the geometry output socket, this right here, to the geometry socket of the join geometry node for each one of those nodes in this list. Next, we probably want to, instead of connecting the top scale elements node, we want to return the join geometry node. Let's go ahead and update the call site right here, and of course right here. Now let's go ahead and execute this script, and there's clearly an issue. And of course, yes, I forgot, instead of using the bottom scale node, I've added two of the top nodes. So that is the problem. Let's rerun the script and look at that. Now we have both of these nodes, the top one and the bottom, going into the Join Geometry node and going out as the final output. Let's take a look at this, and you can see that now we have all the faces, either they're scaled or not scaled depending on that selection group. All right, and if you're learning something new and enjoying this tutorial, make sure to hit the like button on this video. I'll really appreciate it. And for the final touch in this tutorial, I want to animate the scale of those faces. In particular, this field right here, I want to add an animation to it. And to do that, I'm going to be using a helper function that's defined above. And I'm going to scroll all the way up, and it's called create data animation loop. And it requires an object, the data path, the start value, the mid value. So we're going to be going between the start value and the mid value, and then the mid value and the start value, this way creating a loop. I'll be passing in the start frame, the loop length, so how many frames the loop is going to take, and here is the code itself. Now, don't worry if you haven't seen this before. This is basically the same thing as assignment. So I'm going to be using the object, the data path, and then assigning this value to whatever data path we have. And this is done right before we insert the first keyframe. We do the same thing, but for the mid value, right before we first calculate the mid frame by dividing the loop length by 2 and just adding the start frame. So we're using the frame right here. So that's the mid frame, and that's the data path that we're inserting the keyframe into. And then the same thing, basically doing the same thing as we did here, but at the very end with the start value plus the loop length. Okay, let's go ahead and copy this right here and go back to the place where we want to add this. And in particular, we want to add this into the Scale Elements Geo Node, and right here. So I'm going to split all this up like this, and instead of the object, I'm using this right here. So this is the object, the reference that we're using. The data path is this default value, right? It's going to be a piece of text. The start value is going to be 0. The mid value is going to be 8. So this right here. The start frame, I'm going to create a new variable right here and get a random integer to set that as our start frame like this. And random is a module that's imported above. Again, modules are like Blender add-ons, and that's defined above. Let's go to the very top. So this right here, I'm going to go way back down again, and I'm getting the random integer between 0 and 150. This could be any number you want, and I'm using this right here as the start frame. So each time we run this function, we're going to get a different value. So as you know that we have these two groups of nodes, and each one of these nodes is going to start at a different frame, and that will allow us to make it look a bit different. And I'll set the loop length to 90. Let's go ahead and execute our script, and let me add the timeline right here, and I'll hide this, and you can see that we have some keyframes right here, and as we pass them, you can see that the faces scale. And if we zoom in to our Scale Elements Geo Node, you can see that this field is green, and that means that it has some keyframes and animation data assigned to it. All right, but you can see that there's an issue that we've only done this for this part. What can we do to make it seamlessly loop? And to make it seamlessly loop, we can open a new area right here and open the graph editor. I'm going to open the Geo Nodes information, and here is that. So these are the two scale element nodes, And in particular, we're interested in adding a cycles modifier like this. As you can see, it automatically made this into a seamless loop. Let me take a closer look, and you can see that one of these spaces is actually continuing to loop just as we wanted to. All right, and to add this cycles modifier, and again, cycles, don't confuse that with the cycles rendering engine. This is a cycles modifier for the animation data. And I'm gonna move this back right here, and I'm gonna go down. So after we've created the first and the second scale element node, I want to make sure and apply that cycles modifier to the animation data. And to do that, I'm going to be going over the animation data of the node tree and going into actions, the F curves, getting all the F curves that we have, and adding a new modifier. So going into the modifiers of the F curve and using cycles type. All right, let's run this script. And you can see right away in the graph editor, you can see that we've applied that cycles modifier as we wanted to. Take a closer look. I'm going to press space, and you can see that now everything is getting animated as we wanted. And if you have any questions about this code, make sure to ask them in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them. I'll put a link in the description to the final code for this part of the series. Make sure to check out the next video of the series right here. And for more tutorials like this, make sure to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.